Every spring, without fail, I returned to the same old dock in Rockport, Massachusetts, a small harbor town where the Atlantic wind still smells of salt and memory. The boards beneath my boots creaked in a familiar way, and the seagulls never forgot their song. I always went on the same day, the one we said goodbye. I brought the same worn coat, the same thermos, and the same blue handkerchief she left in my hand when the boat pulled away. The scent of her perfume had long faded, but the softness of the fabric still carried the warmth of her fingers. It was April 1943 when we parted. She left for Sweden on a Red Cross evacuation ship for civilians with family abroad, the kind of escape only a few could get. I enlisted that same week. The army sent me across the Atlantic to fight with the 36th Infantry Division in Italy. She said she'd come back. I said I'd wait, and I did. Through the war, through the silence, through the empty mailbox and the sleepless nights, I waited. I waited for her letters, for her shadow stepping off some distant ship, for the sight of her on the dock, wearing that same sky-blue scarf and the smile that could always break through the dark. The war changed me, but not that. People eventually stopped asking. The neighbors thought I was grieving someone who had clearly moved on, but I didn't believe that. No, I believed in what she said. I'll find you again, through this same ocean. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a promise. And a promise is a thing I've never known how to break. So I went back, every year, sometimes twice a year. The fishermen came to recognize me. They'd nod or leave a cup of coffee on the rail without saying a word. They called me the man with the handkerchief, like I was a ghost of the pier, waiting for a woman the ocean had forgotten. But I knew she hadn't forgotten. Sometimes I thought I saw her, in the way the wind caught a stranger's hair, in the profile of someone stepping off a ferry, in a silhouette against the mist. My heart would rise, my knees would weaken, and then nothing. Just the gulls, the ropes, the wood, and the ache of time. Why did I keep going back? Was it love? Was it madness? Or was it something simpler? The kind of devotion you carry, not because you believe she'll return, but because you don't know how to stop loving someone who was once your whole world. I never knew, but I kept coming. If this story is touching your heart the way it touched mine as I wrote it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, brace yourself, because what comes next will change everything. Her name was Evelyn Grace Whitaker, and she lived across the street from me on a quiet road in Gloucester, Massachusetts, back when everything still smelled like baked bread, motor oil, and the sea. We grew up in houses that leaned with the wind, where screen doors slammed in the summer and radios played swing on Sunday mornings. She had a laugh that made you forget whatever sadness you were holding, and eyes the color of rain right before a storm. That grayish blue that could turn silver when the sun caught them just right. We were just 16 when the world started falling apart. I remember the first time I kissed her. It was in a wild flower field out past the quarry, not far from where the sea meets the rocks. It was August 1939, and we had skipped church that day, pretending to go collect clamshells for her little sister's school project. But we ended up lying side by side in the tall grass, staring at the sky. Her hand brushed mine, nervous, shy, and when she turned to look at me, I didn't have to ask. I just leaned in. Our lips touched like a question and an answer wrapped into one, and everything in me settled. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't happen twice in a life. When the war came, it came quietly at first. Letters read in low voices, brothers leaving town in pressed uniforms, fear disguised as patriotism. Then everything quickened. Her father, a Boston-born businessman with Swedish family roots, managed to secure passage for her through a Red Cross initiative. She was to sail to Göteborg with other civilians granted neutral transport. He called it a miracle. Evelyn didn't think so, I didn't either. The night before she left, we met at the dock in Rockport. It was raining, not a downpour, Just that steady New England mist that soaks you slow like sorrow. I brought her a thermos of tea, and she brought me a letter, hastily written, folded twice, already smudged. She didn't say much at first, just looked at me like she wanted to memorize my face. Then, with trembling hands, she took off her scarf, sky blue, with little white stitching along the edge, and wrapped it around my wrist. "I'll come back," she whispered, barely audible over the waves. "Through this same sea, through this same dock, just wait for me." And what could I do but promise? I watched her step onto the ship, her figure shrinking into shadow as the vessel pulled away from the shore, swallowed by fog and silence. I kept my hand on the scarf. I kept my eyes on the horizon until it was just water and gulls and the aching sound of something ending. A week later, I enlisted. They sent me south, Fort Benning, then overseas, and finally into the thick of Italy, fighting with the 36th Infantry Division. We landed in Salerno, trudged through mud and blood toward Monte Cassino. It was hell. A hell made of stone and fire, and names you forget just so you don't break. But even there, even in that place where you counted time in footsteps and lives in inches, I thought of her. I thought of Evelyn every night. I wrote her letters, dozens of them, folded neatly, addressed to a city I wasn't even sure she'd reached. I told her about the olives in the fields, the way the stars looked over Naples, the pain in my legs after marching for 12 hours. I told her about the men who died calling for their mothers. I told her that I loved her, over and over, because maybe if I wrote it enough, it would stay true, even if she never read it. But nothing ever came back. No reply, no news, not even a whisper through the Red Cross channels. It was like she vanished into the mist that swallowed her ship. Still, I held on to that scarf. After the war ended, I went home. Everything was different. The neighborhood quieter, my house darker, the world older, but the dock in Rockport was still there. The same wind, the same salt, the same echo of possibility. So I returned. At first, just once a year, always in April, always with the scarf in my pocket. I would sit on the same bench, watch the boats come in, study the faces of strangers disembarking, and always, I waited. The second year, I came twice, spring and summer, then again in the fall. By the fifth year, the locals started to recognize me, the man on the dock, the one with the scarf. Some called me hopeful, others said foolish. One old sailor drunk on gin and years said, "You're waiting on a ghost, son, you know that." But I just nodded, because maybe I was, but maybe I wasn't. Maybe, just maybe. When someone says they'll come back and you love them enough to believe it, you wait. Not because you're sure, but because you can't imagine not waiting. And so I waited. War has a strange way of stretching time. It turns days into years, and memories into ghosts that follow you through every village, every trench, every sleepless night. After I left Massachusetts, the world narrowed down to a rifle, a helmet, and the dirt beneath my boots. We moved like shadows across Europe, one country to the next, chasing an enemy we only sometimes saw, but always feared. Still, through it all, I carried her with me. Evelyn, not as she was, but as I remembered her, standing in the mist on the dock, scarf fluttering, eyes filled with goodbye. I was stationed mostly in Italy, though we moved often. Monte Cassino nearly broke me. The mountain, the monastery, the endless shelling, I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. There was blood in the mud, screams buried in the wind, and the scent of smoke never left our uniforms. I lost friends there, men with whom I shared cigarettes, stories, and silent prayers. They died inches from me, and yet I lived. I still ask myself why. At night, in the rare quiet, I wrote her letters. I wrote about the hunger, about the way our hands shook from cold, even in the spring. I told her how one of the guys carved me a little bird out of olive wood, said it'd bring luck. I carried that bird with me for the rest of the war. It's still in my drawer today. I wrote her about the sound of church bells in Naples, the light on Lake Como, the way children laughed even in ruins. I wrote to her like I was speaking across time, hoping my words might find her on the other side of the ocean, or the other side of whatever had taken her. But the letters came back, marked "Return to Sender," sometimes just stamped "Unknown Address." The house she was supposed to stay in, her family's relatives in Sweden, had no record of her arriving. No one I contacted through the Red Cross or the State Department could confirm anything. It was like she'd never existed beyond that ship, like I had invented her. But I knew better. When the war ended, I was 25 and felt like I'd aged 40 years. I came back to Gloucester with a medal I never wore and a limp I never spoke of. My father had passed while I was overseas. My mother had moved in with my sister in Connecticut. The house was still there, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Nothing did, except the dock. It hadn't changed. The salt still clung to the wood. The gulls still cried. The water still carried secrets. So I returned. Not because I believed she'd walk off a boat that day, but because part of me still needed to prove I hadn't imagined her. That love like that doesn't just vanish. That promises, even broken by war, leave echoes. The first time back, I waited all day. The second year, I brought flowers, yellow wildflowers, the kind she used to tuck behind her ear. The dock workers began to recognize me. They'd nod, tip their caps, sometimes offer a cup of coffee or just a quiet morning. I didn't tell them why I came. I think they knew. The years passed. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall. I returned with each season, each shift in tide. Sometimes I sat alone. Sometimes children would run past, laughing, reminding me that life, somehow, always goes on. People started to whisper, "He's waiting for someone." A war sweetheart, I think. She probably married someone else. Maybe she had. Maybe she'd never made it. Maybe I was the only one left who remembered, but I held onto that scarf like it was a life raft. Friends tried to set me up. Nice women, kind hearts, good intentions. But I couldn't give them what I didn't have. Evelyn still lived in me, not just as a memory, but as a truth. I didn't keep waiting out of denial. I waited because it was the only way I knew how to love her in absence. It was the only thing that felt right. One day, an old fisherman, Henry I think his name was, sat beside me and said, "You know, son, the sea don't give back what it takes, but sometimes it leaves something behind if you listen." I didn't know what he meant then. Maybe I still don't, but I kept coming. And every time I stepped onto that dock, I felt like I was walking into something sacred, a space where time bent, where I could still believe in what we said to each other that night. I never saw her again. Not really, but I started hearing her. Not in words, but in the way the wind moved, the creak of the boards, the hush of the tide. That's when I began to realize that love, like the sea, doesn't disappear, it just changes form. And yet one day, everything would shift again, not because she returned, but because someone else finally told me the truth. It was the spring of 1951 when the truth first knocked on my door. Quiet, unexpected, and dressed in a reporter's overcoat. I was sitting on the bench at the dock, the one that had become more familiar than my own kitchen chair, when he approached me. Young, clean-shaven, eager in that way only youth allows. He introduced himself as Benjamin Taylor, a freelance journalist working on a piece about wartime refugees, particularly those who had fled Europe through neutral ports. At first, I didn't think much of it. Dozens of people had asked about the war over the years. Students, researchers, a few documentary producers. But Benjamin wasn't just asking about the war. He was asking about Sweden, about evacuation ships, about the Red Cross routes between the East Coast and Scandinavia. And when I mentioned Evelyn's name, just to see if it would land anywhere, his expression changed. He went quiet. Too quiet. He didn't press for more details then. He simply thanked me for my time, took down my address, and promised he'd be in touch if he found anything. I didn't expect to hear from him again. Too many people had promised that. Too many "we'll look into it" letters that led nowhere. But something about his silence that day stayed with me. A week later, he came back. He looked older than before, not in years, but in weight. He held a manila envelope with both hands, like it might fall apart if he wasn't careful. He didn't speak right away, just sat beside me on the bench, placed the envelope on my lap, and said softly, "It's from her sister." I thought, "You should be the one to read it." Inside was a letter, handwritten in looping cursive on yellowed stationery from a town in upstate New York. It was from Margaret, Evelyn's younger sister, whom I hadn't seen since she was a child chasing seagulls along the beach. She wrote that she had come across Benjamin's article in a regional newsletter that mentioned a man who had been returning to a Massachusetts dock every year since 1943, waiting for a woman who never came back. She knew, without a doubt, that man was me. And then, in the gentlest language I've ever read, she told me the truth. Evelyn had never made it to Sweden. The Red Cross vessel, the SS Arvidsson, was attacked just 2 days after it left Boston Harbor. It had veered off course during a storm and entered dangerous waters, where it was mistaken for a military transport. A German U-boat torpedoed the ship off the coast of Iceland. Most aboard were lost. Some bodies were recovered, most weren't. Margaret and her parents were notified weeks later, but in the chaos of the war, with government offices overwhelmed and communication lines blurred, Evelyn was simply marked as missing, not officially declared dead, not confirmed as alive. Just gone. Her family grieved in silence, never knowing how to reach me, unsure if I had even survived the war. But then Margaret wrote something that broke me. Among the wreckage recovered days after the sinking, a leather-bound journal had been found. Waterlogged, nearly unreadable, but one page had survived. It had been tucked in the spine, pressed against the binding, protected somehow from the salt and sea. It was Evelyn's handwriting. The entry was short, no date, no signature. Just a single sentence. "If I don't make it back, tell him I kept my promise, until the very end." My hands shook, reading those words, my breath caught in my throat. All the years I had spent wondering, doubting, hoping, fearing, collapsed into that single line. She hadn't forgotten. She hadn't left me. She had tried. And in the end, she had died carrying the very same promise I had been keeping alive all these years. I didn't cry at first. I sat there, on that bench, with the wind in my face and the letter in my lap, and I felt hollow. Not broken, not angry, just emptied, because the hope I had fed for so long, the hope that had become a second heart in my chest, was finally still. Later that night I went back to the dock. I brought the scarf, the same one. After all those years, it still smelled faintly of lavender. Or maybe that was just memory playing tricks again. I sat, just like I always did, and read the letter out loud. I read it as if she was sitting next to me, listening, holding my hand the way she did that last night in 1943. And in that moment, I wasn't alone. There was no boat on the horizon, no silhouette in the fog, but the wind was softer and the water calmer. And something in the stillness told me that she had heard me, that she had always been with me. From then on, I still returned to the dock, but not to wait, not to search. I came to remember, to thank her, to sit beside the sea we both had loved and tell her in silence that her promise had been enough, and that mine had too. That spring, after I read Margaret's letter and heard Evelyn's words from beyond the grave, I went back to the dock knowing I would never see her walk down those planks toward me. I knew she would never stand there in that blue scarf, arms open, smiling as if the war had never touched us. I knew that the sea had taken her, not as a thief, but as a witness to a promise she and I had both tried to keep. And yet, I still came. I brought a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind she used to love, tiny white daisies, a few sprigs of clover, and one or two forget-me-nots I'd managed to find along the edge of the woods behind my old family home. I didn't wrap them in paper or tie them with a ribbon. I simply held them in my hand, the way I once held hers, gently, as if afraid they might vanish. I sat on the bench like I always did, but this time I didn't watch the horizon. I didn't scan the ferry decks or lean forward at the sound of footsteps on the dock. I just sat. I let the wind speak to me. I let the salt sting my eyes. I let the silence do what it had always tried to do, settle inside me like a tide, finally coming to rest. I don't remember how long I stayed that day. Maybe an hour, maybe 3. But at some point I began to speak aloud, not in full voice, but in a kind of quiet murmur, like prayer. I told Evelyn about the letter, about her sister, about the line in her journal and how those words had lifted something heavy off my chest, something I didn't even know I'd been carrying all those years. I thanked her, not just for loving me, but for staying with me in every season, through every silence, for being the reason I kept my heart open even when it hurt to do so. I told her I forgave the ocean, I forgave the war, I forgave the world for being so cruelly indifferent to two people who just wanted to live and love in peace. And then I stood, laid the flowers at the end of the dock, and whispered the only goodbye that ever mattered. There was no great revelation, no vision in the mist, no music or thunder or sign from heaven, but there was peace. And after so many years of waiting, it felt like enough. I still came back to the dock, of course, not as a man waiting, but as a man remembering, as someone honoring a part of himself that would always belong to someone else. The scarf remained folded in the same small box I kept under my bed. The letters I had written, the ones I never sent, stayed tucked away in a drawer, yellowing with time, fragile as autumn leaves. Neighbors stopped asking. Most of the old fishermen had passed on. A new generation filled the town, younger folks with phones in their pockets and noise in their ears. But every now and then, one of them would sit beside me and ask, "Who were you waiting for?" And I would smile and say, "Someone who kept her promise." Some stories aren't meant to end with a kiss or a reunion at the train station. Some don't finish with a wedding or a parade. Some stories, the real ones, end in quiet places on old benches, with the sea stretching out endlessly ahead, and a heart that still knows how to love through the silence. I never married, not because I couldn't. I had chances. There were kind women who shared meals with me, who listened to my stories, who would have gladly held my hand through the long winters. But I had already given my life to someone else, and you only get one life to give. Instead, I built things with my hands. Furniture, mostly. Chairs, cabinets, tables. I found comfort in the grain of wood, in the way it told its own silent story, in how it could be shaped, even after being cut down. Maybe that's why I loved carpentry so much. It taught me that things could still be made whole, even from what was broken. Over time, the dock became less a place of mourning and more a place of gratitude. I didn't feel the ache as sharply. The silence didn't feel cruel. It felt like company, like a kind of answer that doesn't need words. Some days I still think about what could have been, about what it would have looked like. A life with Evelyn, a house filled with books and laughter, maybe a daughter with her eyes, maybe a son who carried her name. But I don't dwell there, because I had something rarer than a long life together. I had a love that endured even death, and in its own quiet way, that love became my life. The years have folded in on themselves like waves curling back into the ocean that first carried her away. I'm 91 now. The world looks nothing like it did when I last held Evelyn's hand, and yet some things, the important things, have not changed. The dock is still here, the sea still speaks in whispers, and the silence that once haunted me has become something else entirely. I live alone in a modest house on the edge of town, a place built for quiet. Worn floorboards, warm light, windows that let in the wind. My hands aren't as steady as they once were, and my knees complain more than they should, but I still move through my days with purpose. I make tea, I fix broken hinges, I write a little, and sometimes, when the weather allows, I ask a neighbor to drive me down to the harbor. The bench is older now, weather-beaten, a little crooked, but it still holds me like it always did, like it remembers. I don't bring flowers anymore, I don't read the old letters. I just sit, and when I close my eyes, I can almost hear the light steps of a girl in a blue scarf walking toward me through the years. I've kept everything. The scarf is folded in a small wooden box, one I carved myself and inscribed with the words, Göteborg, 1943. Her last letter, the one from her sister, the one with Evelyn's final words, is tucked inside, along with 2 photographs and a pressed wildflower that somehow hasn't crumbled. It's not a shrine, it's a reminder of who she was, of who I became because of her. Sometimes I think about those letters I wrote after the war, dozens of them. Pages and pages of thoughts, of stories, of questions she never got to answer. I never mailed a single one. They were never meant for the post office. They were conversations between me and the silence, between the man I was and the boy who never stopped waiting. Looking back, I don't regret a single moment, not the waiting, not the heartbreak, not even the years of uncertainty, because I loved her. Fully, fiercely, without condition, and she loved me back in the only way the war allowed. We were separated by oceans, by time, by fate. But love didn't break. It endured, quietly, steadily, like the tide. People ask me now if I ever feel lonely. Sometimes, but it's not the kind of loneliness that begs to be filled. It's the kind that remembers, the kind that knows something once mattered so deeply, its absence still leaves a shape. And in that shape, in that space, there is still love. I don't wait for her anymore, but every time I sit on that bench, I listen. Not for her voice, but for the memory of it. Not for her steps, but for the hush of the water that once carried her promise to me. And I smile. Because the silence, it doesn't hurt anymore. It just means she was real and that she stayed. We share new stories every day, real stories that move and inspire. If this one touched your heart, leave a comment and share it with someone who still believes in lasting love. Thank you for being part of this journey.